This was a collaboration primarily with Christine Shostrom. Mauricia Lopez really dealt with the museums, which there were many that we had to deal with, and she had a background in that. But Christine, some of you may actually know her. She is in the España DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, and has lived in Seville, Spain for many years, and that happens to be where all the archives, Spanish archives on colonial St. Louis are located. So it really allowed for an unparalleled examination of this history that really had not been done before. So with that, I'll go ahead and start. One of the interesting things about this is that for the longest time, this history really was embodied in popular stories. There really wasn't any sort of professional analysis of it, and in fact, there was a very prominent historian named J. Thomas Scharf, who wrote a history of St. Louis City and County in 1883, and he came to the conclusion after doing a fair amount of research and contacting people that, and I have the quote up there on the screen, it seems reasonable to conclude that the popular account of the attacks of 1780 is mainly an issue of ingenious fictions fabricated by creative imaginations during 50 years of oral history traditions. And he was not alone. In fact, there was a very prominent professor, Professor Sylvester Waterhouse at Washington University, who also thought there was absolutely no credibility to the fact that this battle ever happened. And it wasn't until Stella Drum, who was the librarian of the Missouri Historical Society, was able to access what's now called the Voorhees collection of the George Rogers Clark papers down at the Missouri Historical Society, that she was actually able to find what the newspaper touted in 1932 as conclusive proof of the battle. And it's kind of interesting because she had only worked from the George Rogers Clark papers, and quite frankly, only a portion of them, a valuable portion, but only a portion of them, as others were still being put together and assembled after the death of Lyman Draper. And in addition, she didn't really have much access to the Spanish archives, which were still in disarray. They had records that had been shipped from Cuba after the Spanish-American War to Spain and sat there in a warehouse for quite a long time. And we're talking rooms full of documents. I mean, it's unbelievable how many there are. And then finally, the British records. And those weren't, the Haldeman papers weren't really organized until the mid-1900s. And even then, the compilations that were put together were not complete. So it's been an ongoing story. I'm sure somebody will come along sooner or later and find something we haven't, but we still continue to look, and we have thoroughly gone through the three primary sources. So for those of you who aren't familiar, on the left is a map of North America at the time of the American Revolution. And you'll see that the area of Canada, the 13 colonies, and the area to the west is all British. But that wasn't always the case. There was a war called the 7 Years' War. It was known as the French and Indian War here in North America, that pitted France and its ally Spain against Great Britain. And France and Spain were the big losers. So Canada, which was French, and the area here that was on the east side of the Mississippi River, which was also French, were given to the British. This area on the west side was French, but in a secret treaty between France and Spain to partially compensate Spain for entering the war, the French transferred Louisiana to the Spanish. So that's how St. Louis and Louisiana became Spanish shortly after the French and Indian War, about 1763. The headquarters of the new Spanish colony was at New Orleans, and there were two lieutenant governorships, one at St. Louis and one at Natchitoches. And here's a period map of New Orleans. It was fairly populated. St. Louis, as many of you know, wasn't established until about 1764. New Orleans was much earlier. And they were all then subservient to the Governor General in Cuba at Havana, who really made all the very high-level decisions under the king. So why were St. Louis and Cahokia, which I'll get to, attacked on May 26, 1780? Well, there were several reasons. First, some of you are probably familiar with George Rogers Clark, where he went on a secret expedition authorized by the state of Virginia, came down from Fort Pitt down the Ohio River secretly, and was able to capture Vincennes, Kaskaskia, and Cahokia. These were all British possessions, though the populations were mostly the leftover French inhabitants from the prior French domination. And there was a brief attempt for the British to recapture it, but in a daring march during the middle of winter, Clark was able to recapture Vincennes. So the American side, or the eastern side of the Mississippi River, was now American that had previously been British, and the British wanted it back. Secondly, many of the British traders from the northern areas wanted to trade down the Missouri River. There was good trade with the Osage Indians, and they were not permitted to go down there, and they weren't granted Spanish licenses. The Spanish only wanted to grant them to their subjects. They went down there anyway, and the reason we know that is in the 1930s, a farmer hit a big box, and they opened it up and dated it, and it was full of British musket repair parts dated to the 1770s, and it was located outside of one of the little Osage villages. So they were penetrating the Missouri River illegally. Thirdly, the Spanish, although they weren't involved in the war, they were anxious for revenge, and they weren't ready to enter the war, but they sure were ready to sell the Americans war supplies. And those war supplies came up the Mississippi from New Orleans under Spanish flags and went across the Ohio River all the way to Fort Pitt. Some of them also went to St. Louis to help arm George Rogers Clark's band. But the biggest reason that St. Louis and Cahokia was attacked, that Spain was finally ready to enter the war in 1779 and declared war against Great Britain. So what happened? Well, almost immediately, and this is where it gets really interesting because it doesn't get mentioned in hardly any of the history books, is Lord George Germain, who was the de facto commander-in-chief of North America for the British, ordered a very comprehensive plan to recapture the entire Mississippi River Valley. He ordered General Campbell from the south, who was at Pensacola, to assemble a force, take New Orleans, and come up the river to Natchez and wait there for another force that he ordered to be assembled from the north. And of course, this is the one that involved St. Louis and Cahokia. So he sent orders to Governor Haldimand in Canada, who in turn sent the orders to the lieutenant governors at Michilimackinac, Detroit, and Fort Niagara. Now, Fort Niagara is too far away, but Fort Detroit and Fort Michilimackinac weren't. So from Michilimackinac, they organized an expedition that would start from Prairie du Chien here on the Mississippi River. It would be the primary force that would attack, and it would be supported by another force under Charles de Langlade coming down from Chicago down the Illinois River. But from Detroit, there would be all these diversionary attacks. There would be a diversionary attack against Vincennes, another one against Kentucky, the area of Kentucky, and the third one against Fort Pitt, all to prevent the Americans from sending reinforcements. So what kind of force was made up of this attack force? Well, it wasn't British regulars as we're used to in the 13 colonies. Why? Because there weren't many British regulars out here in the West. There were maybe 60 at Fort Michilimackinac and maybe another 200 at Detroit. Most of them were not equipped for wilderness warfare and were needed for defenses of the forts. But what the British did have is they established Indian departments. And there was a northern Indian department and a southern Indian department, as you can see from the map there. And in the north, the Indian department posts were at the major forts. And of course, Michilimackinac and Fort Detroit each had their own Indian department. And these departments were authorized to commission officers, captains, lieutenants, interpreters, and their sole job was to keep all the various Native American tribes firmly allied to the British. And that's what they did. And they're the ones that organized this force. And we know the names of several of them from the British records. But in addition, the British Indian departments were authorized to commission Native American chiefs of merit to be special war captains. And so there were two major chiefs of this expedition, Chief LaPasha and Chief Natchitoches, and they were both commissioned as war captains, or sometimes referred to gorget captains, because my clicker seems to be out of juice, but if you look in the middle there, there's a silver metal gorget, and that was worn around the neck, and it has the British coat of arms on it. And I'll be talking about the museum exhibit that's going to be upcoming on this, and we actually have some of those gorgets that'll be displayed. But the British Indian Department organized the forces. It was made up of several Indian tribes, and the reason that the Indian departments were also very crucial is they had to keep peace, because many of these tribes had very bitter relations with the others. So in early May, this force departed. There were about 750 of them. They departed Prairie du Chien. They stopped at the Sac and Fox village of Saukanack and picked up another 250 Sac and Fox warriors. So there were about 1,000 of them that came down the river. So what was going on at St. Louis? Well, one of the attractions to the British was that St. Louis was totally undefended. There was no defenses whatsoever at St. Louis. But what St. Louis did have is they had advance warning, and it's kind of amazing considering how thinly populated the area was. They weren't warned but once, but twice, but several times of this attack. And 6 weeks, finally when they believed it, because they didn't believe the first one, they had 6 weeks to prepare. And one of the famous people that came down was Madame Honoré. She and her husband and sons had a trading post on the Salt River, and she actually paddled down by herself and came down to warn the Spanish lieutenant governor, because she knew him personally, and he took her very seriously and started planning defenses. Initially, the lieutenant governor wanted to build a number of stone towers and fortifications, but they didn't have the money, number one, and they didn't have the time. So instead, they built one stone tower, about 35 feet tall. I'll show you on a map in a minute, but it was located near Ballpark Village, and it was the high part of St. Louis at the time. And around it, for 2,000 yards on both sides of the stone tower, they dug entrenchments, which you can see an example there to the right of dirt thrown up and built into a wall so the defenders could stand behind it and be protected. Now, Spain only maintained about 29 regulars in the area, but there was a large militia. And Spain, unlike the United States and other areas, after their defeat in the 7 Years' War, they put a special emphasis on militia. Militia was required to train every Sunday after Mass. They were trained in the basics of wheeling and firing. They even had uniforms. And one of the things that we found right after we finished the book, unfortunately, was a letter from the captain of the militia cavalry unit talking about how Fernando de Leyva had asked all the men to make their own uniforms, and they did, and they were inspected by de Leyva to his satisfaction. So there were quite a few of them, and in all in total there were about 310 men. And as Fernando de Leyva said in his record of the battle, there was not a man left in the house at the time of the attack. So we know they were all mounting the walls. And then finally, there weren't any big cannon, well, there weren't any big cannon in the area, period, but the larger cannons that were available, the 4 and 6 pounders, weren't at St. Louis, but they were at a fort up on the Missouri River, and Fernando de Leyva sent a militia captain up to retrieve those, and they were hoisted up into the tower. We also know when they started the tower, because there was an official ceremony. There was a blessing that was given on April 17th of the first stone of the Fort San Carlos, and it was signed by Father Bernard de Limbach, and he also noted that there were quite a few people, not only militia officers, but other people that attended this very solemn event. So as I mentioned, there were 5 cannons that were hoisted in the tower. The tower was just about complete. And you'll see several other instances of artwork we had created for the book, shows the tower. The upper parapet wall was not quite fully complete. They used some boards and other workings. I have an image there of a cannon, only to show you, if you can see the arrow pointing to wedge, that's how they adjusted the elevation of the cannon. It was kind of very inaccurate at the time. But they were fortress-style cannons. They weren't field cannons. They had the big wheels that you could wheel around. This will give you a better idea of your bearings. Everybody knows Ballpark Village. You can see it down there on the right. The tower was about where 4th and Walnut Streets are today. The entrenchment lines ran, as I said, both sides. It was a little shorter to the north and a little longer to the south. Here's a map that we had made showing the attack. So on May 26th, the attackers came out of the north. They expected St. Louis to be totally undefended. They even sent a force down to the south because there was a road down to St. Genevieve, and they expected all the St. Louis inhabitants to flee down there once they were attacked, and they were hoping to capture them as well. So obviously they were shocked and surprised when they came upon St. Louis and it had all these defenses. And about 750 of the attackers attacked St. Louis. The other 250 went to Cahokia, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the attackers came, they saw the entrenchments, they tried to find a way in. Native American tactics were not geared for siege warfare, so they went up and down trying to find a way in. They even tortured some of the farmers that they captured in the field, hoping to lure some of the militia out, and none of those tactics worked. So after about 2 hours, they retreated. And part of the reason they retreated was that the Sac and Fox Indians, who had been kind of coerced into joining the attack, retreated. And it's not really clear why they retreated, but when they retreated, it caused pretty much a total collapse of the entire attack. Now, as I mentioned, a couple people were tortured. Actually, despite the fact that they knew the British were coming, they were quite a few people out working the fields, and I guess life has to go on, and they had to till their crops. But this is where most of the casualties and prisoners occurred, right outside of the town. And here's a panoramic view, just to give you an idea of the scope and size of the attack and the battle. St. Louis was built in an elongated fashion. You can see kind of a little bit to the right of the tower there, there's the church, and a little bit farther to the right is the Governor Mansion, the former Laclede and Chateau House, which was rented out to Fernando de Leyva. We actually have very good information, and I'm pretty sure we are the first to actually publish the list. There's been some attempts to decipher it in the past, but we have actually published the list from the Spanish archives of all the people that were killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. And I think we've done a pretty good job in terms of translating it. It's difficult because the Spanish, although they took great records, they tended to change the French names to Spanish names. So not only do you have the French to deal with, then you've got the Spanish translation as well. So in many cases, it becomes difficult. But there were 21 people that were killed during the battle, 22 if you want to add one that was killed trying to escape that same day. His name was Cardinal. And there were 7 wounded and 25 prisoners. This is all around St. Louis. In addition, there were 46 more prisoners that were captured along the Mississippi River as the attack force came down the river and surprised various trading posts and people in boats. The British claimed only 4 dead and 4 wounded, all Winnebagos. I find that a little hard to believe, and after reading all the correspondence afterwards where they were trying to plan another attack, I suspect this was partly propaganda to minimize their losses. There are a number of stories that are associated with the battle. I'm only going to go through a few here, but they're kind of interesting, and we had some special artwork made for several of them. One is the picking strawberry story. That comes from Madame Ortiz, originally Elizabeth Barada. She lived to, I believe, 106, and she was 14 at the time of the attack. And as the story goes, from what she tells, that the scouts came a day earlier to confirm that, in fact, St. Louis was undefended. And they were unable to get close enough to the town to see, because all the residents, not all, but most of the residents, were out picking strawberries and flowers for the Feast of the Corpus Christi. And for those of you who are Catholic in here, you'll know that's a pretty important feast. So they were out in the fields. The picture to the left I took, it's from the old courthouse. It was painted a long time ago. It has the strawberries in it, I'll give it credit for that, but it has wooden walls in the background. There were no wooden walls around St. Louis at the time. They were built after the battle. Another interesting story, which seems to be a favorite, is Madame Regauche. As the story went, at the first alarm of the attack, She grabbed her husband's militia coat, picked up a knife in one hand and a pistol in the other, and ran to the main gate to urge the men on. And so I became very interested in her, and I found that she was married to Ignace Regauche, and Ignace was, in fact, in the militia list of the time, and they both lived in a lot that was very close to the main gate. So there's a lot of credibility to the story. Obviously, I can't verify everything, but it's interesting. As St. Louis became American and the French importance diminished, the story of Madame Regauche began to grow to help amplify the French importance. In fact, there's a book in the 1820s that pretty much credits Madame Regauche for single-handedly saving St. Louis. So the story kind of grew. But she did go on, and this is documented, found the first girls' school in St. Louis. So she was a very important lady. Another story is the mad dash to the gate. That's my term for it. As this story goes, there was a group of people out in the fields, and they were lucky enough to have a small cart or carreta with 2 horses with it. And at the first sign of the attack, all 6 of them piled into the cart and headed into town. They were all shot. 1 of them was killed. The horses were shot several times, but managed to make it into the town, where the 2 horses fell dead immediately. That's the story. So I started trying to figure out if these people actually existed. Well, interestingly, in the casualty list amongst the wounded, the names Louis Chancelier, Madame Baguette, which is actually Baquette, but that's the Spanish version, her 2 daughters, and an American named Kennedy. Well, Kennedy's not in the list, but the other ones all are. And some of the stories said that Madame Baquette was Louis Chancelier's wife. That's not true. There was another marriage of the same 2 last names, so there was an in-law relationship. But the Madame Baquette and her 2 daughters, which I found in the baptism records, were all there and all the right age. So they all matched up. Now, Kennedy was more of a problem. And my best guess is it's Matthew Kennedy, who was a frequent trader from St. Genevieve in St. Louis, because there's another interesting entry on the casualty list, otro que se halló, meaning another who was there, an unknown soldier, if you will, or an unknown participant, and that may have well been Kennedy. Another interesting part of the story is that of those 310 men I mentioned, 60 of them came from St. Genevieve. Fernando de Leyva was very concerned. He knew there was a very large force, and St. Genevieve was also Spanish. And so he summoned 60 militiamen and the few regulars that were there to come to St. Louis. They came up in boats, and most of them were hunters, so they were actually very, very valuable men to have at St. Louis during the attack. So that's St. Louis. So what was going on at Cahokia? Well, as I mentioned, George Rogers Clark and his Americans had conquered the east side, Cahokia, Vincennes, and Kaskaskia. But George Rogers Clark was busy building Fort Jefferson down near the mouth of the Ohio River at the Mississippi River. And he too got word of the attack, and from several different people, different from the ones that warned St. Louis. And finally, he organized a group of men and came to the defense of Cahokia. Now, a couple interesting things. You'll see I have an old fort picture up there. There was a teeny little fort in the middle of town that was a leftover from the French era, and it was pretty much worthless, so it wasn't even used for the defense. But there was a very large stone building and a very large lot that was formerly owned by the Jesuits, the missionary property. And those of you who have been over to Cahokia to see the Holy Family Catholic Church,
yes,
that church sits on the sill of this stone rectory. So about 8-9 years after the battle, the church was built over this particular building. So that is the exact site of the attack. I went over there and walked it numerous times with John Reed, the historian, to get a kind of an understanding of how the attack unfolded. They had one field cannon. We were able to find a requisition for gunpowder for the, quote, field cannon in the requisition records, so we know that they had some defenses. Here's a painting we had done. The rectory building's on the left. There was a small stream. It's not there anymore. You can see the bed of it if you walk around enough. It's called the Rigolet Stream, and you could actually get a flatboat up it back then. But it was fordable, and the attack force of about 250, mostly Native Americans, but some British-aligned French traders and British Indian Department personnel came across and attacked. And of course, the same thing happened here as St. Louis. They had had advance warning. They had put up defenses. They centered their defense around the mission property, and the French built their houses with wooden walls around them, so they amplified that with earthen defenses. And they were able to repel the same attack and the same thing. The Native Americans tried to find a way in, couldn't find a way in, tried to lure them out. As the British commander said in his report, they tried every strategy they could. They couldn't get the Americans out of their defensive area, so they too retreated. And here's a map that kind of gives you an idea of the attack. You can see St. Louis up there in the corner, and the mission property there with the blue bands showing the defenders and the attacking British in the red. So after the British attackers retreated, the Americans and the Spanish got together and put together a pursuit force of about 350 men. And the British actually retreated in two directions, up the Illinois River and another up the Mississippi River. The American-Spanish force followed them up the Illinois River, and some of them then continued up the Illinois River, and the others went cross-country to Sacanock, which was the Sac and Fox village. Those going up the Illinois River were too late. By the time they got to Chicago, there were a couple of ships waiting there expecting to unload prisoners and booty, and instead took the retreating British off in their ships to Michilimackinac. Over on the Mississippi side, the British attackers eluded them as well. But to send a message, the Americans and Spanish stopped at Sacanock, and if you recall, this was the tribe that kind of precipitated the retreat. And since they were the closest tribe to St. Louis, they bore the full brunt of the fury of the Americans and Spanish, who burnt their village to the ground, and they left a note saying, "We'll be back with a larger force." The note actually worked. Good psychological warfare. The chiefs came down to St. Louis, this is all documented, and they brought their British flags, their British medals, and their British commissions, and they gave them to the Spanish. And the symbolic nature of that was to show a change of allegiance. And of course, what did they get in return? Spanish flags, Spanish medals, and Spanish commissions. Yeah. And we actually, there's some commissions. This one on the left is from the period 1781, a little bit later. And it's at the Missouri Historical Society. The British one on the right is at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and the peace medals that were given to the Indian chiefs there you will be able to see at the museum exhibit next year. Now, the British planned to come back. They weren't finished. They were very frustrated. They thought they were very close to capturing it, but for faulty ability to keep it secret, it failed. So they were planning another attack, and the Americans and the Spanish knew it. So they established advanced warning posts. One of them was at Piasaw and was later moved farther north on the Mississippi River once the Sac and Fox tribe made peace with the Spanish. And then another one was at Peoria, LePay back then, to give an early warning. And the number of, these were manned mostly by militia from St. Louis. And in fact, they got further intelligence that the British were stockpiling supplies at Fort St. Joseph's on the south of Lake Michigan for their attack. So in the dead of winter, the new Spanish lieutenant governor, because Fernando de Leyva unfortunately died very shortly after the attack, the new lieutenant governor authorized an attack by Spanish militia who went up in the dead of winter up the Illinois River, surprised Fort St. Joseph, and burnt it to the ground and took all the supplies. There were some friendly Potawatomi Indians that went along with them, and they distributed the supplies amongst them and took the rest of them back to St. Louis, and a few to Cahokia, because there was a small contingent from Cahokia with them as well. So that's the presentation, and some of you are wondering why the cameraman has been here today. I don't know where he is. There he is back there, Paul. HEC-TV is doing a documentary based on the book that will come out in May of next year. And so one of the scenes I think that'll find its way in here, some of the pictures he's taken today, at least we hope so. I have a very short trailer here, which I hope works here in a second to show you. It's about 2 minutes, so it's not very long, and it was taken very early in the process, so it's really not an indication. There have been probably a dozen more interviews, and there'll be a lot of artwork and images that are used. Well, let's go back and try that again. I clicked it once too many times.
Well, I think most people, when you first say the Battle of St. Louis or the Battle of Fort St. Carlos, think it must have been an American Civil War battle. They come up to me afterwards and say, I never heard of this before.
Like to say that they saved the future of the United States.
Ignacio La Rosa, Devon Kerr, Pedro de Hetra, Fernando de Leyva, he was the commandant.
If you look at the history books today, the American history books, there's not a mention of it. Most people that would go to a ball game would have no idea that that's where the tower or the battle was fought. You continuously find new things. Part of the challenge is that some of the particularly like the Spanish archives, they are not organized in a sense to make research easy. Sometimes you find things that are in places you would have never expected. This is where we came from. This is how our area developed, and it is important to understand. How did this town come about? Why did it survive? What part did it play? And it turned out to be a pretty major part in the American Revolution.
For Leyva saying, you know what, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to defend this place. That took some chutzpah.
And for those of you wondering why House of Thunder, well, the popular story is that the Native Americans, after their defeat, named the tower the High-Fenced House of Thunder because of the cannon booming. That's where it came from. Thank you. Oh, do we have time for questions or not? I mean, it's your meeting.
No.
All right, well, if anybody has any questions, if not, I have some books if anybody would like to buy. Yes, sir.
Yes.
We believe that St. Charles actually sent some troops to that battle. Are you aware of that?
I have not found any documentary evidence of that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The Spanish kept a lot of records. We have most every militia list from 1779 to 1783. They could be in there. I can tell you that the militia lists don't tally up totally with the number of men there. So either there were free blacks, there were men from St. Charles, or other men that were there that just weren't designated as such. So I can't verify it one way or the other. Yes?
You mentioned wooden forts on the Missouri River. Where were they?
Right near the confluence. They were built in the late 1760s. They were meant to keep out the British traders that came down the Missouri River. They weren't very effective, and an area flooded, and in fact the forts were pretty much abandoned. There was actually a log cabin with one soldier living in it at the time they went to get the cannons. Yes?
To what extent, if any, was Daniel Boone involved in this whole fracas?
Not at all. Yes?
How many did you say came from St. Genevieve?
60 militiamen and then a few regulars that were posted down there.
Well, Steve, why don't you talk about what's going on in St. Genevieve?
Yeah, that's the museum exhibit too. So what we're planning to do in conjunction with the release of the HEC-TV documentary, which Paul, I think, is still planned for May. Okay, May of next year, is that we will be opening up a museum exhibit. It'll be called the American Revolution in the West, but a big chunk of it is going to focus on this battle that you heard today. We'll have weaponry, regalia, medals, gorgets, flags, all sorts of things that will be on display. They have about 2,000 square feet of space in a brand new building down there that just opened up last year. So it'll be quite something to see. I mean, we're having uniforms handmade for the militia and the various British Indian Department officers. So it'll be quite. I have a little flyer with a few things on it up front, and then there also are some handouts with some information. And we're certainly always looking for donations because there are some costs. We've had some of the DAR chapters provide some money to us, but anyone would like to help out, the information's up there and you're free to grab a flyer.
Steve, can you put the first slide back up, please?
Sure. I think Paul wants to film something, so bear with me a minute. This one? Okay. All right, yes, ma'am.
Is the list of the people who came from St. Genevieve in your book?
It is not in my book, and there is actually not a list of those who came up from St. Genevieve. There is a list that exists of a force that came back a little later to reinforce. So some of the theory is it probably was the same people. I suspect a lot of them were the same people because they were mostly hunters, people that didn't need to farm the crops and were not expendable, but certainly had more ability to go up and leave. But there is no list that we have found, and we've looked. I mean, with Christine, you know, we had unparalleled access to the archives in Seville, and we have every militia list. Now, I can tell you where that list will be, is that we are doing a book for the museum exhibit, and there will be a special article with all the militia lists from the period in it, including those 60 people from St. Genevieve. Yes. Any other questions? If not, yes?
Does this tie in at all with the treaties signed at Portage du Sioux?
No. This is all the American Revolutionary War. It was all resolved more or less at the peace table in 1783. What happened, although Spain was obviously a big helper, they weren't an ally of the United States. A lot of people get that wrong. They allied themselves with France. So they didn't have to make peace with us. And so the rights over the Mississippi River became a huge issue. And in fact, at New Orleans, they closed off the Americans from going down the river. So part of this led to, and this is a story beyond today, ultimately to the Louisiana Purchase. But no, this was all the American Revolutionary War. Yes?
I think it would be nice if you would mention why you began this project.
Oh, well, I thought Joan had mentioned it, but I'll certainly mention it again. I had been looking at this history for probably 25 plus years. I didn't think anybody was interested in it. And the reason I did is that I had an ancestor who was at the battle and actually found his name in the militia list. His name was Joseph Rubidoux. I knew from my family that we had Rubidoux connections, or the one that founded St. Joseph, Missouri, but it was his father who was from St. Louis, who came down, I found, from Montreal in 1770 to St. Louis, who was in the militia and in the battle at the time. Mm-hmm. And no other questions? Thank you all for listening, and if anyone would like some books, I have plenty of books here to sell and sign too. Thank you.
And because everything becomes interrelated, right? So the local chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution is the Fernando de Leyva chapter. And Christine wrote up a history of Fernando that the guys now have on their website. But because of the work that she's done with Steve and for the chapter, the Spanish government has now recognized Fernando's birthplace, and a plaque has been put up. Because they did not know of his importance. I mean, literally, they didn't know in Spain. So St. Charles, of course, has history. In doing research for something else, I found a record at the Missouri History Library of one of my ancestors, George Gaddy, which was in Spanish. So I am going to be in Seville in 3 weeks, and I'm going to the archives with Christine.
Oh, wow.
And it is my hope to find things with her help, since I obviously don't speak Spanish, and bring back copies of things for the St. Charles County Historical Society archives. So keep your fingers crossed that works out for us.
Look for that militia list maybe of St. Charles people.
That's
Yeah.
true. That's true. We can do that. All right. So let's get back to our agenda. Meeting is called to order. If you notice on the back side of your agenda is the minutes from the last meeting from July